This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In her new book, Becoming a Teacher, Melinda Anderson introduces us to LaQuisha Hall, who makes a 17-year journey from nervous rookie to Baltimore's Teacher of the Year. We go deep inside the classroom and schools with her to witness the many challenges teachers face and are expected to conquer. And we get a clear-eyed assessment of how Black students are often mischaracterized or stereotyped as problematic. And we also get an all-too-rare chance to see how a Black teacher navigates her path to professional excellence. Melinda, welcome to EWA Radio.
Hi, Emily. Thanks for having me.
So, Melinda, I want to start with how this project began. The book is part of a series on master teachers. How did LaQuisha Hall get on your radar?
LaQuisha Hall was a teacher that surfaced very early in my research because I was looking for a teacher, a Black teacher specifically, that would be an exemplar for the profession. And so I reached out to my network. LaQuisha was the 2018 Teacher of the Year in Baltimore City. And she is someone who very quickly I gravitated toward. She's very dynamic. She is very involved in her community. She is so proud and loves her scholars. She has a strong presence on Instagram and Twitter. And so she was someone that I was able to see that she would be an ideal subject for this book.
When I was reading the book, I was jotting down, sort of subject headers for myself to think about some of the themes that are in here. And sadly, one of the big one is the terrible things we do to new teachers. You write how LaQuisha figured out that, sort of forcing newbies to struggle is part of the culture of teaching. But, it took decades to change the rules around how medical students are trained. When somebody finally said, maybe they shouldn't be treating patients when they've been up for 36 hours straight. Why can't we get this right when it comes to new teachers instead of throwing them into this deep end of this very deep pool and just expect them to swim?
Well, that's a great question. We do know that mentoring new teachers improves their satisfaction and their longevity in the classroom. And you would think that when you know better, you should do better. But the culture of teaching forces newcomers to struggle. And it's just so ingrained. Mentoring should be the norm and sink or swim should be the exception. But weirdly, it's just the opposite. And in writing this book, I interviewed different people in LaQuisha's orbit throughout her 17-year career. And the one person she credits most with keeping her in the classroom and shaping her into the teacher she is today is her mentor, Regina Bullock. She was an older Black teacher in the English department who took LaQuisha under her wing and guided her in writing lesson plans and loaned her books and all of the perfunctory duties a mentor teacher might perform. But more than that, she took a personal interest in her. She knew LaQuisha wasn't just new to teaching, but she was 21 years old. She had just moved to Baltimore from North Carolina. So Mrs. Bullock became her sounding board on everything from what to wear to why she should pay teacher union dues. She invited her over for dinner. She really became her school mom. And she told me Mrs. Bullock used to write her name in permanent marker on everything. So as a habit, LaQuisha now does that too. She was effusive about what Regina Bullock meant to her. And one of the things I found most surprising, though, was how much Mrs. Bullock gained from spending time with LaQuisha. When I interviewed her, she said after teaching more than 30 years, she was invigorated by spending time with this energetic new teacher. And I think that's a part of the mentoring piece that no one really talks about, which is the benefits for longer serving teachers who could use a boost.
Well, that's fascinating. And of course, that kind of relationship developing depends on, it's a two-way street. You have to have, first of all, a rookie who's willing to be open to that mentorship and to taking advice and guidance. And you need to have that veteran teacher in the classroom who's willing to take on that role. And we do know that those are in short supply. And here's a quote from your book. You said, but teachers helping teachers is a supplement, not a replacement for the systemic support that early career teachers require. What are some of those systemic supports? What would a really good new program for new teachers look like?
Well, I think it really starts with in teacher education, changing the idea that you have to do this individually. There's this real heroic type of narrative that we've built about being a good teacher, as opposed to shifting the narrative to it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to ask for help. One of the things that LaQuisha has done because of the support that she received from Mrs. Bullock is pay that forward. And she goes out, she does workshops, she speaks to incoming teachers, and she basically says, don't stop asking for help, pestering them, letting them know what you need. And so I think the programs really have to be integrated between teacher education and school districts so that when you're onboarding teachers, the realities of teaching, that it's not a solo enterprise, is really infused into how teachers are brought into schools.
There's another theme in your book, and I think it runs counter to what a lot of people might think or expect or presume if they haven't spent time in schools, especially in high schools in large urban areas that are, believed to have a lot of different kinds of challenges. And that is that the hardest part is the kids. But really, what your book tells us, and I'm calling this section "When Adults Get in the Way." And it felt like LaQuisha many times was running into other adults who were setting her aside or not valuing her contributions because of presumptions they made or frustrations with their own careers. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, you hit that nail right on the head. It is funny because you would think that the most difficult part of teaching would be learning to engage with the kids, when in fact, she found the most challenging people that she confronted could be the adults. And sometimes she even said to me, this is the hardest part of coming into the school building each day. And that's an aspect of teaching that's seldom addressed, right? Even in teacher education programs, there's no a class on how you talk to parents or how you engage with other adults in the building that you're going to be interfacing with. But LaQuisha had the self-awareness and the willingness to try to learn how to work with these, kind of difficult people. And so basically she would have adults who were, administrators who would come into her classroom and, they were kind of checking up on her. It may have felt like a gotcha. Or she would have parents who were either, praising her or criticizing her. And she just learned how to navigate that. But I think that she also found that her positivity was something that she had to preserve, and she wasn't going to let adults kind of steal her shine, even though her path from rookie to master is kind of peppered with, adults who may not be as positive. She sympathizes with them, but she's determined not to be jaded, because she knows in order to give her best to her students, she has to feel her best. And she would say to teachers when they would come in and they would complain, which is common, she jokes about, don't go in the teacher's lounge because that's always, like this swell of negativity often. But she would say, did anything good happen today? Just to redirect the energy vampires who can, kind of suck the life out of you with their negativity. And it's amusing because you can see they're caught off guard because it's their natural impulse. Often the systems in which they work and the conditions in which they work can be very difficult. And the impulse might be to complain. And that's definitely a thread that runs through the book, these moments of her finding solutions rather than fixating on problems.
Well, let's talk about that because we talked about some of the adults who get in the way, but there are also adults who help show the way. You talked about one of them, her mentor, Mrs. Bullock, but there are also some examples of what can happen when there's really great school leadership or district leadership, including new leadership for Baltimore?
Yes, the superintendent in Baltimore, Sonia Santelises, has been very vocal in helping break down the silos that are between leadership and teachers in the classroom. And she has this philosophy, it's called leading from your seat. And basically, wherever role that you have in the district, she wants to respect that expertise and have that filter up so that everyone can participate and have their voices heard in areas that can improve the district overall. And LaQuisha, as an example, because of the negative perceptions that are often in the media and in the public about Baltimore, she started a social media campaign called Teen City Schools, and she encouraged teachers to send in posts on Facebook about what they love about teaching in Baltimore City. And it was in response to a negative story that had appeared on the television or in the newspaper. And Dr. Santelises was overwhelmed by the response and just really identified LaQuisha as the embodiment of this philosophy. She said, this didn't come out of my communications department. It didn't come out of my marketing department. It came out of a teacher who loves this district, who loves her students, who knows what they're capable of, and wanted to counter those negative messages that were coming from the media. And she was very congratulatory of LaQuisha and wanted that kind of spirit and mindset to be a model for Baltimore City Public Schools.
I think it's important that we make it clear that your book holds up LaQuisha Hall as an example of a master teacher, but she's not a paragon. She's not perfect. She's human. And she acknowledges a lot of her challenges and even some early missteps in her career that she had to learn from, some of them stemming from her own lack of experience with some of the challenges her students were facing, but also on the gender front. And there's a really beautiful section where she realizes she's having conflicts with some of the boys in her classroom because she was expecting them to demonstrate skills they had never been taught. And I was fascinated by that because, of course, the vast majority of the nation's teacher workforce are women and white women at that. So what do you want to talk about there in terms of how do we address that?
Well, that's a great piece to pull out. And yes, LaQuisha had to adjust and adapt and change her teaching techniques. And in this case, she realizes that she's being much too hard on the boys in her classroom. She didn't grow up with brothers. And she was translating her high expectations of men in general to her young male students. So she reflected on why she was struggling in this area and decided she was scrutinizing the boys' behavior when she had never told them what was expected in her class. And it's a really sharp example of how teachers translate their observations into meaningful data, right? So instead of coming down on her male students because they're talking over classmates, for example, and thinking, well, they're supposed to know better, which is a common occurrence in classrooms, she taught them by modeling the good behavior she expected of them. She gave them the opportunity to correct what they may not have learned in prior classrooms. And she had to learn how to teach across differences. And to your point, in this case, it was gender, but this applies broadly, whether it's gender or race or religion or any other kind of identity. The vast majority of teachers are white women who often lack the tools to navigate across difference. And so they may avoid it. But students can't be the only learners in the room. And that is what LaQuisha is modeling. Teachers have to stretch themselves and be learners too.
A big takeaway from this book is the importance of solving what you refer to and many people call the leaky bucket, which is high teacher turnover. We know that about between 40 and 50% of new teachers are going to leave within 5 years. And that's especially important for trying to close achievement gaps for Black and Brown students who are underserved. But solving that leaky bucket for Black teachers is also incredibly important for all students because we know the research shows that having a teacher of color helps raise achievement levels across the board in the entire classroom. I just think that's just really a powerful message here is how much we're losing when these teachers don't get either a fair shot or a supported shot to really dig in and build a career.
I dedicated an entire chapter because of the critical role of Black teachers. They are necessary. The research backs up the importance of Black teachers for all students, not just Black children. And anecdotal feedback speaks to the importance of Black teachers. To me, it's a decided point that we need more Black teachers. But what my book makes clear is that there are systemic factors working against this worthy objective, like the praxis test, which is proven to be a consistent barrier keeping Black teachers out of the profession. It almost kept LaQuisha out of the profession. And it's been proven again and again that standardized testing is inherently biased. So why do we rely on this one test is the question that I pose in the book. There are also conditions in schools that make Black teachers, particularly in mostly white schools, feel like outsiders. So I recount an example in the book of a Black teacher who confronts a coworker who is sympathizing with those flying the Confederate flag and has to explain that as a Black woman, that was sympathizing with people who enslaved her ancestors. She had been teaching for a while and she had a network to kind of support her and talk her through that. But imagine being a brand new teacher and coming up against that situation. That could feel really daunting. So I think too often in education, we ask the question, how do we get more Black teachers into the classroom? And there's tons of studies and reports and, you could fill a room with them, basically expanding on all the things we need to do to get more Black teachers into the classroom. But the question really is, what changes are policymakers and school districts willing to make so that Black teachers want to come and want to stay in the classroom? And I would also add that in the rush to recruit and retain more Black teachers, we need to acknowledge that race match alone is not foolproof. It's about more than tallying a racial scorecard. And I also speak to this in the book because simply the fact that a teacher shares a child's race doesn't mean that that teacher is inherently able to build and sustain positive relationships with Black children. And I do relate an example in the book that documents why Black teachers also benefit from learning culturally responsive approaches to teaching.
We're talking with Melinda Anderson, author of the new book, Becoming a Teacher. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Melinda, we've talked a little bit about what you found in your book in reporting. Now I want to turn to how you did it. And I want to start by stealing from our friend and colleague Steven Sawchuk over at Education Week. He noted on Twitter that you outline the realities of public schools, but you don't relitigate the education reform debates around how those became entrenched or what's the best way to fix them. How early in the writing process did you make that decision to just set that aside?
Well, the decision not to revisit the same arguments was purposeful. And it was motivated basically by my exhaustion with these education debates that siphon so much time and attention. I wanted to profile great teaching, period. I wanted to showcase what it's really like to practice teaching at the highest level. And to be quite frank, there are countless other books you can read if you want to be immersed in these same tired education policy debates. My book chronicles how testing and alternative licensure and pay and all of the other issues that influence and impact teaching how they play out. But this book is about one teacher's path from her first year to her 17th year. And it was more important to me to look at all of the nuances and complexities that surface from those issues rather than contrasting whether they're good or bad. LaQuisha, for example, is an alternatively certified teacher. She was Baltimore City's 2018 Teacher of the Year. Yet alternative certification receives so much scorn from some quarters in public education. I want readers to be lured away from seeing education in dualities. Ideas are right or wrong, or policies are good or bad. I just think the binary thinking that pervades education policy is tiresome and boring. And I want my book to be a refreshing change from that.
What was the writing process in terms of getting access to LaQuisha? Did you make any agreements up front about certain things that may stay on or off the record? Was that difficult to navigate as you went so deep into her personal life and experience?
The access started with the school district. I had to get permission from Baltimore City Schools to come into her classroom. And once LaQuisha was agreeable, given the fact that she had been the Teacher of the Year in 2018, they were familiar with her. And so that kind of helped ease the process. But the thing I found most interesting was letting go, I think, of my romanticized idea of what shadowing a teacher entailed. So I thought I was going to walk in and this was going to be really thrilling for her and I was going to be her sidekick. And it was none of that. I don't know where I got the idea that it was going to be, this idealized version, but LaQuisha was pretty blasé about it. She was very friendly and very welcoming and very warm, but she was busy. So she was like, there's a desk, have a seat. And she went about her business, teaching her class. And I would say over time, spending time with her, spending time with her colleagues, with her husband, with her family, I shadowed her in and out of the classroom. So over time, we developed a friendship. But in the beginning, there was no pretense. And in fact, we were laughing about this the other night because she actually said sometimes she even forgot I was in the room or I was around. So because of that, I was able to get much richer material because she wasn't performing for me. She was just doing what she does. And I have to say, as a journalist, at first it was kind of unsettling because I think I was expecting her to have this stars in the eyes moment or something. And it was in the moment that I realized I'm so glad that it wasn't that at all, because I was able to narrate and give readers a much more authentic connection with LaQuisha. One consistent thing I've heard from people who've read the book is that she seems real and genuine, and she is. And one great example is when I was reporting during the last week of school in June 2019, her high school had held a year-end cookout for staff, and she was recognized as a high achiever. And I'm thinking she's going to be all excited. And her reaction was basically, I didn't need a meal today. All I'm doing is cleaning out my room. I needed a meal earlier in the year because I was hungry and when I had to teach. And it's great that they think I'm a high achiever, but what I really needed was to know that I was a high achiever on those days when I was teaching, and I needed a boost because by that point, the kids were gone. It was the last week of school. It was just the staff. And it hit me just how profound that truth really was, because what she was saying was, I'm a teacher. This is a teacher recognition event, but you never asked me how I want to be recognized. You're just doing what you've always done. And it was an example of using her story and her truth, which is so indicative of education overall, just doing what we've always done. So I definitely feel like the experience taught me to be more present and I guess I would say, less distracted and concerned with perfect storytelling and just kind of let this story happen. I had to get out of my head and out of my own way.
I'll be candid, Melinda, and I'll say I recognized myself in this book in terms of mistakes I made as an education beat reporter. Some of them were assumptions, others were missed opportunities. I'll share one example. You wrote how LaQuisha Hall had to battle the stereotypical headlines about youth crime and violence in Baltimore when she was trying to get the local media outlets to cover a really positive and meaningful event, and that was that many of her students had self-published books they had written in her English class. I think a lot of education reporters will hear this or read this and remember getting an email like that at some point in their career and just, sort of brushing it aside. I'm curious, did you recognize as you were following her and shadowing her any mistakes you made as a journalist?
I don't know that I would characterize them as mistakes, but as I was just relating, I think that I often go into reporting with a kind of firm idea of the story that I like to tell, right? Because I'm a freelancer. So I'm pitching a story to an outlet. And this is the story that I have distilled into a pitch. This is the synopsis. And so I go out, and obviously stories change and, they mold and they shift. But I think in writing this book, I had to be so much more fluid. And it's definitely something that I will carry forward in my reporting. LaQuisha was very unfiltered with me. And to your other question about were there things on the record, off the record, everything was on the record. She had no qualms about really opening up her life and her teaching practice. She was very honest, as readers will see, about her struggles earlier in her career. She did not want to be exceptionalized. And she is an exceptional teacher. She's an outstanding teacher, but she didn't want to be held up as, look at me and I'm so great, this superhero, superstar teacher. She was very honest about her difficulties and her struggles and the days that, she goes home and she has to download with her husband about, should I go back tomorrow? And so that's a really honest portrayal of her career, of her life as a teacher. And I think that obviously that came because I had the amount of time to spend with her, but that's definitely a quality that I want to bring more into my reporting, because I do think that sources often are performing for us, right? Like we call them, they want to give us the perfect answer. They want to give us, that perfect soundbite. And I think that I need to allow more time to bring out more authentic responses and to help them portray themselves and what they need to say in a way that is more real.
The education journalism workforce mirrors the nation's teacher workforce in that it is predominantly female and predominantly white. And not every education reporter is going to bring the ideal range of experience or a cultural awareness and sensitivity to their assignments. So, what do you think we should do about that?
Well, as I referenced earlier, just as teachers have to stretch themselves, so do education reporters. We've spent a summer of stories on racial reckoning as it applies to schools. And I have to wonder how many of the white education writers who produce those stories spent any time this summer building their own racial and cultural literacy, right? Stories on pandemic pods are mostly framed as wealthy white parents versus poor Black parents. But this story crosses race and class lines. You have affluent Black parents opting for pod schooling too, but that story isn't as prominent. So the need to be learners too is definitely a message that applies equally to our profession. Another piece that I think education journalists can take away from this book and just consider in their reporting is that Black teachers are teachers, okay? You can interview them on issues that have absolutely nothing to do with race. LaQuisha is a master teacher. She's published more than 100 student authors. She developed a pioneering approach to literacy with nearly 100% of her ninth graders started the year as reluctant readers, and by the end of the year, those same students had read 190 books. Reading this book, it's clear that this is a woman who has something to teach us about reading pedagogy. But how often does an education reporter look to a Black teacher in a majority Black high school as a pedagogical expert? As journalists, we need to ask ourselves why we continue to portray mostly white women who make up the bulk of the teaching profession, granted, but they are not the symbol for great teaching. They shouldn't be. And we should be more mindful that Black teachers shouldn't be relegated to stories on the shortage of teachers of color and simply stories specifically focused on race and racism and culture.
Melinda Anderson is the author of Becoming a Teacher. It is part of Simon & Schuster's Masters at Work series. She joined us from her home office in Silver Spring, Maryland. Melinda, thank you very much for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.